The August heat in Memphis was the kind that pressed down like a hand on the chest. Elvis had grown up with this heat, knew it the way he knew the sound of his own voice, and yet on the morning of August 5th, 1962, sitting in the half-dark of the Graceland dining room with a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, the heat felt different, closer, like something with weight. He had not slept. This was not unusual. Sleep had been a negotiation for years, something he coaxed rather than claimed, but this particular sleeplessness was different from the ordinary kind. It did not come from the residue of a crowd's energy taking hours to discharge. It came from something quieter and harder to name. A feeling, as his grandmother used to say, like waiting for a train you're not sure is coming. Joe Esposito found him there at 7:15. Joe was one of the few people in Elvis's life who knew how to enter a room and deliver bad news without softening. Not because he was cruel, but because Elvis had a horror of the space between knowing something was wrong and knowing what it was. The waiting was always worse. Marilyn Monroe died last night, Joe said from the doorway. His voice was steady, his face careful. They found her at her home in Brentwood. They're saying it was an overdose. Elvis said nothing. He sat with the information for a long moment, his hands around the cold coffee cup, his eyes somewhere past the far wall of the dining room, somewhere past Graceland, somewhere past Memphis. His face did not change dramatically. There was no sudden intake of breath, no visible crumbling. Grief in Elvis went inward rather than outward, collecting in him like water in a low place, invisible until you got close enough to see. How old was she? He finally asked. 36. He nodded once. Then he stood, carried his cup to the kitchen, and walked upstairs without another word. Margie Hampstead, the housekeeper, watched him go. She told her daughter years later that she had never seen him walk up those stairs that way. Slowly, she said, like a man carrying something too heavy to move fast with. He had met her twice. The first time was at a studio party in Los Angeles in the spring of 1960. 6 weeks after he returned from the Army, Paramount had organized a gathering for the cast and crew of GI Blues, the kind of Hollywood event that existed primarily to give people in expensive clothes a reason to stand in a well-lit room and remind each other of their importance. Elvis attended reluctantly, on Colonel Parker's insistence, wearing a dark suit and the expression of a man who had learned to perform ease when he felt none. He saw her from across the room. Marilyn Monroe, in the spring of 1960, was 33 years old. She had just finished Let's Make Love and was preparing for The Misfits, which would become both her last completed picture and the final act of her marriage to Arthur Miller. She was, by every visible measure, radiant, the kind that fills a room the way a sound fills a room. Not intrusively, but completely, so that the space seems different once it contains her. But Elvis noticed something the photographs never captured. She was standing at the edge of the gathering, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of people, holding a glass of champagne she wasn't drinking. Her eyes moved through the room with the weariness of someone who had spent a very long time being watched and had never fully made peace with it. She smiled at the people who approached her. She performed the precise and exhausting alchemy of being Marilyn Monroe in public, and underneath it, visible only if you knew how to look, only if you had done the same thing yourself in enough rooms and on enough stages, was the fatigue. Elvis recognized it the way a sailor recognizes weather, not with certainty, but with the body, with the part of him that existed before fame, before Colonel Parker, before Sun Records and the Ed Sullivan Show and all the rest of it, the part that was still a boy from Tupelo who understood what it meant to work very hard at making sure no one could tell how tired you were. He made his way across the room. "Mrs. Miller," he said, because she was still married to Arthur Miller, and because he had been raised to use proper address. She looked at him with those famous eyes, pale gray-green in person, the color of shallow water, and for a fraction of a second he saw something flash across her face that he would later identify as relief, not at seeing him specifically, but at the approach of someone who was not going to perform enthusiasm at her. "Mr. Presley," she said. Her voice was softer than the voice from the films. "You're standing over here by yourself," he said. Not a question. "I am," she said. "Me too," for a while there. She studied him then with genuine attention. "Do you mind it?" she asked. "The parties, all of this." She gestured vaguely at the room around them. He thought about it honestly. "I don't mind it. I just don't always know how to be here when I'm here. Like you're supposed to be present, but there's no way to be present. Because the room isn't there for you. It's there for the idea of you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, just that. Just yes." They stood together at the edge of the gathering for 20 minutes, talking about nothing consequential, the food, the light, a mutual acquaintance. They did not discuss their careers or their marriages or the weight of what they carried. They talked the way two people talk when they have recognized something essential in each other and don't need to discuss what it is. The recognition is enough. When Marilyn moved to leave, she paused beside him and said, quietly enough that no one else could hear, "You take care of yourself, won't you, Mr. Presley?" It was not a throwaway pleasantry. He understood that even as she said it, she was not making small talk. "You too," he said. She smiled. Not the famous smile, but the other one, the one underneath. And then she walked away, and he watched her cross the room and disappear into the brightness of the party and the machinery of being who she was. He thought about that exchange more times than he could count in the years that followed. Not obsessively, just the way certain moments surface without being summoned, arriving in the middle of ordinary days. He thought about it in dressing rooms and on film sets and in the backs of cars moving through cities where his name was on marquees. He thought about it the way you think about something that carries a truth you haven't quite finished understanding. The second time he saw her was briefer. January 1962, at a small dinner at a mutual friend's house in Beverly Hills. They nodded at each other from across a table and exchanged no more than a sentence. But he noticed, they both noticed, that neither of them was performing that night the way they usually did. It was a small gathering, intimate, low stakes. They were allowed, for one evening, to simply be there. She looked tired. He remembered that. She looked the way he felt, but had been told not to show. He had meant to call. He didn't know what he would have said, but he had meant to. The way you mean to do the things that exist at the edge of what you understand about yourself. He never did. He stayed in his room until early afternoon, not sleeping, just being in the dark, with the curtains drawn, in the silence of a house that was trying to leave him alone. Lamar Fike sat outside the bedroom door for 2 hours without knocking, not out of helplessness, but out of the specific attentiveness of someone who understands that some grief is interior work that no company can improve. When Elvis finally came downstairs, around 2 in the afternoon, he went to the plain upright piano near the east wall, not the performance piano, but the one he played when no one was listening, and he sat down and played for a long time without stopping. He played hymns, the old ones, "How Great Thou Art," "Peace in the Valley," fragments of things without names, things that came from the deepest part of his musical memory, the part that preceded everything else and would outlast it. He played with the pedal down so the notes blurred into each other, the melody more felt than heard, a vibration rather than a sequence. Red West stood in the hallway and listened. He had heard Elvis play this way before, in the worst moments, and recognized it for what it was, not performance, not practice, something more fundamental. A man using the only language he had left when all the other languages ran out. Charlie Hodge sat on the bottom step of the staircase and didn't move for 40 minutes. Nobody spoke. The music went on. At some point, without stopping, Elvis began to cry. Not loudly, not with the drama of it, just with the quiet, unstoppable physicality of grief. The way a leak becomes a flood Not through violence, but through accumulation. His hands kept moving on the keys. The hymns continued, and underneath them, barely audible, a man was coming apart in the language he was most fluent in. Red West would say, years later, that it was one of the only times in his life he felt he was witnessing something too private to be witnessed. It wasn't about Marilyn exactly, he said, or it wasn't only about Marilyn. It was about something he'd been carrying a long time. Seeing what happened to her broke something open, like a door you've been holding shut, and someone reminds you what's behind it, and your hands give out. There is a photograph taken at Graceland sometime in the mid-60s, exact date disputed, that shows Elvis at the piano in what appears to be a private moment. His profile is caught by the light, his hands resting on the keys. On top of the piano, slightly out of focus among other items, is a small framed photograph of Marilyn Monroe. Not a publicity shot, a candid, informal image. Marilyn in a light coat, laughing at something out of frame. No one ever asked Elvis about that photograph. No one who knew him well needed to. What changed in the months after that August morning was not dramatic. It was the subtle interior kind. The kind that shows up in small behaviors, in the language of eyes and posture, in the things a person stops doing or starts doing differently. Elvis became quieter about his own situation. Not more resigned. If anything, less resigned. In the way that grief sometimes produces a temporary clarity about what matters and what doesn't. He began to talk, in private, about the pills, not confessionally, not to anyone who could help him in any formal sense, but to the people close to him, in the dark hours after shows when the guard came down. He talked about the arithmetic of performance, the way the shows extracted something real from him, and the pills were meant to fill the space. The way filling the space had started to feel less like restoration and more like maintenance. His cousin Billy Smith remembered asking him once, sometime in late 1962, what he thought about when he thought about Marilyn Monroe. They were sitting on the back steps of Graceland, late at night, the Memphis summer finally releasing into something almost cool. I think about the gap, Elvis said, between who you are and what people need you to be. How you spend your whole life trying to close it and it never closes. He stopped. Let the sentence end without finishing it. Billy didn't push him. She was braver than me, Elvis said finally. She kept trying to make herself into something real inside all of it. I gave up trying a while back. I just play the part now. Another silence. Maybe I'll try again. He did try. The trying was uneven and incomplete, and ultimately came too late to alter the trajectory already set. The forces shaping Elvis Presley were not individual choices, but structural realities. An industry, a contract, a mythology so large that the man inside it had long since lost the leverage to push back with any effectiveness. He would not win the battle with the pills. He would not find the kind of human connection that might have provided a counterweight to the loneliness. But those closest to him noted that something had shifted, that he was present in a different way, that he reached for people with less performance and more genuine attention, that the listening, when it happened, was real. In the summer of 1969, 7 years after Marilyn Monroe's death, Elvis returned to the stage for the first time in nearly a decade. The shows at the International Hotel in Las Vegas have become legendary. The comeback, the vindication, the proof that he was still there. What is less often discussed is the mood of those weeks of preparation. He was lean and focused and more physically present than he had been in years, like a man settling accounts with himself before walking into something important. The night before the first show, he sat alone in his dressing room for a long time. The entourage gave him space. They had learned when he needed it. A member of the hotel staff reported later that she had heard music through the closed door. Just a man playing something soft and unrecognizable on the piano that had been brought in at his request. She stood in the corridor and listened. It was the saddest thing I ever heard, she said, and also the most beautiful. It sounded like something ending and something beginning at the same time. He came out of the dressing room 40 minutes before the show. Hair perfect, face composed in the way of someone who has finished whatever needed finishing and is ready for what comes next. He walked down the corridor and stood for a moment in the wings. Then the music started and the lights came up, and Elvis Presley walked out into the brightness and became what the world needed him to be. He always did. That was both his gift and his grief. On August 8th, 1962, the day of Marilyn Monroe's funeral, Margie Hampstead found a small arrangement of white gardenias on the dining room table at Graceland. No card, no explanation. The flowers carried that particular heaviness of scent, old-fashioned, southern, the smell of formality and grief, and the tenderness of people who express what they cannot say out loud. She asked Joe Esposito where they had come from. He told her he wasn't sure. Neither of them pressed further. There are things that exist in the private interior of a person that were never meant to be explained. Some gestures are complete in themselves. The flowers were still on the table 2 days later. Then they were gone. No one mentioned them. There is a particular category of human loss that does not have a name in English. The loss of someone who was not quite close enough to mourn publicly, but whose absence changes the shape of the world in ways that are hard to articulate. The loss of a witness. Someone who saw something in you that others didn't see, who recognized something that you yourself had trouble recognizing. Elvis Presley would have resisted the suggestion that Marilyn Monroe knew him. They had spoken twice. In total, perhaps an hour of actual human contact. He would have been right to resist the romantic excess of claiming a deep connection where the facts didn't support it. But she had looked at him across that room in 1960 and seen something real. Not Elvis Presley the phenomenon, not the king of rock and roll, but the person inside the performance. The tired man trying to figure out how to be present in a room that had been configured to contain a myth rather than a human being. She had recognized that. And recognition, when it comes from someone living the same truth, is not a small thing. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, one of the rarest things there is. Elvis Presley died on August 16th, 1977. He was 42 years old. The people who had been closest to him understood that the physical causes were downstream of something else. The cost of sustaining a myth, the price of becoming what other people need you to be and forgetting or never quite learning how to also be what you need yourself to be. On the piano in the Graceland living room, when the paramedics arrived that day, the small framed photograph of Marilyn Monroe was still there among the ordinary artifacts of a private life. Margie Hampstead saw it when she passed through the room. She stood still for a moment, her hand at her throat. They were the same kind of lonely, she said, years later, to her daughter. The kind that comes from everyone wanting a piece of you and no one wanting the real thing. She went first, and I think when she went, he understood something about how his own story was probably going to end. The photograph was packed with the other personal items and stored at Graceland, where it remains today, not on prominent display, not part of the official narrative, simply there, a small, private thing, the echo of a recognition between two human beings who happened also to be famous, who were tired, who were trying, who looked across a crowded room and found each other in it. You take care of yourself, won't you? You too. That was enough. That was everything.